Okay, so we've made our application in React, and the next step is going to be to create a database and an API so that we can actually have persistence in our web app. So the idea is we're going to make it so that when you type in a name and a phone number and hit submit, it's actually going to store that in a database, and then every time you come to this website, it's going to have those details here saved. So in order to do that, you will need to do a couple of things. Well, the main thing that you'll need to do is head to cloud.mongodb.com, cloud.mongodb.com, and create yourself an account. And then once you've done that, build a new cluster. This is going to be free as long as you select the right things. So you need to make sure that you select one of these that says free tier available. It's not free for me because I've already used a free one. And then everything is basically fine, and you just leave this all as it is and hit create cluster. Okay, so that cluster has been set up. So our next step is going to be to set up some security so that we're actually allowed to log into that. Because right now we're not. So if we go to database access under security, so you're going to need to create a user, so add new user, and you'll just make an admin user that is like this one. So it'll be, the username will be admin, and that's basically it. And then you give it a password, and whatever that password is what we're going to use to log into the database. Okay, so I've created myself a user called Phonebook with the password 12345, and that's what I'm going to be using for testing. We're going to create a new folder, and this is going to be for our API. So I'm going to call it phonebook-API. Okay. And then I'm going to open that. I'm going to open that here. Open folder. So what's an API? An API is basically the middleman between the front end of our application, which is what we see. It's the stuff that we've just built with React, and the database. So the database is just going to be like a piece of paper, basically, that has, in our case, our list of contacts in it. The reason we need an API is because if you imagine a website like Facebook, if your front end had access to everything in the database, then that means that you would have access to everybody's Facebook account and everybody's data, which is not what you want. So you need an API in the middle that can basically decide if you should have access to whatever it is that you're trying to get. So this is the guy that does all the application logic. The API, when it gets a certain request, will go to the database, grab stuff, it might manipulate that stuff, and then hand it back to you. So in our case, what's going to happen is our front end is going to shoot off a request to the API. It's going to say, hey, I've got a new contact that I want you to put in the database. Then the API is going to say, cool, Mr. Database, here is a new contact. And the database will tell the API when that has succeeded. And when that has succeeded, the API will send back to us, yep, it's succeeded. Or it will send back an error. And it's the same sort of thing when we first log onto the website and we want to grab all of the contacts that are stored in the database. So we'll say, hey, API, how many contacts? Well, give me all the contacts from the database. And then it will do that. In the context of a much more complicated app like Facebook, the front end might say, hey, give me all my friends. And the API will figure out who you are and then give you only your friends, rather than you having total access to everything in the database and sorting through everyone to figure out who your friends are. So that's an API. So essentially, you, the client, make a request to the web server, and it looks the same as like a normal request that you would make. The only difference is, rather than you getting a web page back, you're going to get some raw data back. And there are 4 different types of requests that can be made. You can make a GET request, like this one. You can make a GET request, like this one. Or a POST request, PUT, or DELETE. So a GET request is for getting something. So you're getting a list of users in this case. A PUT request would be for updating something. So if you update a user's credentials, then you would use a POST request. A delete is obviously for deleting something. And what's the other one? Post is for sending something to the web server to be added. So in our case, when we're giving the server a new contact, that would be a post. And when we turn up and we want a list of all the contacts, that would be a get. So back in our blank Visual Studio project, I'm going to go back to our terminal. We're going to go npm init to create a new project. We're just going to basically say yes to all these things. We don't care. This is all good. No problemo. Okay. Yes. All good. Done. And now that's created for us this package.json. Excellent. And so this means that we can start adding dependencies to this project. So we are going to use this thing called Express. So Express is a thing that somebody made to help us do routing in Node.js. So what's routing? When a request comes in, there needs to be some process to figure out what to do with that request. And that's where routing comes in. So Express is like the framework that will say, okay, well, it will allow us to say, okay, when a request comes in for /get contacts, do this. So we have to get Express. And it says here, the way that we get Express is npm install Express with -- save. What does that mean? Well, if I type npm install -- save, or to be shorter, which I'm going to do, I can do -s, and then I name what I want, Express.js. Oh, whoops, it's just Express. Just like when we initialized our React project, this will download Express. It will chuck it in our, it will chuck Express in our dependencies in our package file. So we can see Express has been added as a dependency, and it has downloaded 50 packages, which it's put in our node modules here. So this is all the stuff that makes Express work. So now we can use Express in our project. So I'm going to create a new file and call it index.js. And this is going to be the main file that will be executed when our server starts. Now when we deploy this, we actually want to be able to type npm start in order to start this server, because the server needs to be running. It needs to be constantly listening to requests that come in. The idea is that every server that is on Node will start with npm start. But for that to work, we have to tell it what happens when we type in start. So if we go to our package file, we need to actually add another script here. You see, we've got a test script. So if we did npm test, it would run this, which would do nothing because we don't have any tests yet. But if we type in start, we want to do this, node index.js. So that means use node to run index.js, which is our index file that we've just created. Cool. So now when we actually deploy this on AWS or something, and when their system tries to run our server by typing in npm start, it will actually work. So what do we do here? We're going to create a variable, and we're going to call it express. So variable express is going to be equal to require express. This is very similar to the sort of stuff that we were doing in React. We're importing all the stuff. And we're going to say app, which is going to be a representation of our entire application, is going to be equal to express, but executed. So what does that mean? This is going to execute the constructor for express. It's going to give us an object, an object for our application. Cool. And then we're going to say app.listen, and we're going to listen on port 80, and that's it. So what this is saying is, this has actually created our server now. Our server actually works. We're saying create our application using Express, call it app, and then listen on port 80. 80 is the normal web port. So that's done. This is actually going to run now. But if we run this, npm start, nothing's happening, which is confusing. And like, it makes sense that nothing's happening because we haven't coded anything, but it would be nice if we got like a message saying that this works. So as the second argument to this listen function, we can actually pass in an anonymous function. You would remember this from our React days, because this is JavaScript, so it's all very similar. And I'm going to say console.log server is running. So now if we close this, by the way, we can stop this from running by going Control C and then Y for yes, terminate. On a Mac, I think it's Command C. Actually, it might also be Control C. And then we go npm start, and this time server is running. Yay! So we have some actual indication that the server is working, which is nice. Now in here is where we can, this is where we decide what happens when we get requests. And this is how we do it. App dot post, because so I'm going to start by coding up the post request that is going to happen when the server gets sent a new contact to go into the system. So app.post, and this is going to happen when you go to this address slash, what would it be? Contacts. So essentially what I'm saying is, if you send a post request to /contacts on this server, then what are we going to do? Well, we're going to do whatever this is. And we can pass in a function, bear with me, that looks like this. So this is a function that takes in two arguments, rec and res. This stands for request, this is a response. So you're starting to see how this kind of makes sense now. So if we're going to get a request and a response in this code, that means that we can take the request, which in this case would contain the new contact, and we could say, okay, we could like do whatever we have to do. So we go to the database, we save it, whatever, and once it's saved, we can go res.send to send something back as a response. So this would go back to our React app. But before we can contact the database, we need to set that up, because right now this has no connection whatsoever with the database. So in order for us to communicate with our MongoDB database, we're going to use something called Mongoose. And the way that we're going to get Mongoose is by typing npm install -s mongoose. And this is doing the same thing that we did before with Express. So we've got 19 packages added. Mongoose is now a dependency. And now we can start using Mongoose. So we're going to say Mongoose equals require Mongoose. Same thing, we've got a reference to it now. And then down here, we're going to go mongoose dot connect. And this is the connection, this is the method that will allow us to actually connect to the server. So here is where we'll put a string that will be like our connection string, which I'll talk about in a second. And then here, just like before, we can put in a function that will execute when we actually connect. So we can say, we'll console log here, database connected. And what's our connection string going to be? So this is going to be like the address of it's sort of like the address of our server plus the username and password to actually connect to it. So if we go back to MongoDB and you go to your clusters, you find the cluster that you want to connect to, and we can go connect here. So we can go connect your application. And here's the string that we're going to use. So we copy that. And now we can paste that string here. And that's our string. Now here where it says username and password, you have to replace that with your username and password. So for me, my username is phonebook and my password 12345. Excellent. And now this here, this test, this is the name of the database that you're going to be accessing. So you can name your database whatever you want. I'm naming mine phonebook. So we can test if this has worked by running npm start and seeing what happens. Okay, so we can see our server is running now. We've got some deprecation warnings, which is, what is it saying? To use the new parser, pass option, blah, blah, use new parser. Okay. So this is basically a message from the creators of Mongoose that are saying that we should do something a bit differently. So let's put that in, let's listen to them. And then it's saying, server's going on again, is deprecated, we'll move future version to use the new pass option, use unified topology. Okay, so let's just do that as well, because they're telling us to. They know best, because they made the thing. Alright, so what I've done now is I passed an object as the second argument to this connect thing. And then let's see how that works. Maybe we won't get those messages anymore. Excellent, much better. Server is running, database connected. Perfect. So now we can do stuff. Now, I mentioned before that our database is just like a piece of paper. It has no idea about the format of our data. So what that means is we have to tell it what is the appropriate format for the data that we're going to be passing in. We essentially have to say, what does a contact look like? So to do that, we have to create a model. So here's how this works. We can just do it up here. So I'm going to say variable contact equals mongoose.model. And then we get to name it. So I'm saying that this will be called a contact, like that. And then we have to pass in an object that represents, the schema. So the schema is essentially the format for this object. So I'm saying that a contact will have a full name, and that will be a string, and it will have a phone, and that will also be a string, like that. And now we can actually put contacts in and out of the database because we know what a contact is. We've just done it right now. We've specified what a contact is. Now, let's look at our request again. So this is the code that will be executed when we get a request, a post request to /contacts. I'm going to create a variable called full name, and that will equal rec.body.fullname. So what this means is basically whenever a request contains some data, that will be contained in rec.body. So what I'm assuming here is when we do the front end side of it, when we actually construct this request, we're going to be getting an object that will contain full name, and it will also have to contain the phone. Equals rec.body.phone. Cool. And now we have to do two things. We have to construct a new contact, and then we have to save that contact to the database. Well, three things actually, because then once it's saved, we have to send a response back saying, yes, it's been saved. So we're going to go contact, we're going to go new, var new contact equals new contact. The new keyword means that we're going to construct a contact. It's saying we want a new instance of contact. And here's where we're going to actually pass in the data. So we're going to say full name will be equal to full name. Phone will be equal to phone. So that's equal to that. That's equal to that. We actually could have simplified this, and we could have just passed in rec.body directly, because our body is just going to contain full name and phone. So it's actually the same as this object. But this illustrates where we're getting it from. Once we've done that, we go new contact dot save. Boom. And then if we pass this a function, this function will be called when it's actually successfully saved. Well, I say successfully saved, not actually successfully saved necessarily, because we may get an error. So when this function is executed, it will give us an error object and the actual data that we have saved. So we can say if there is an error, something bad's happened, else we're fine. So if everything went fine, we're going to go res.send data, and we're just going to send back that saved contact. If there's an error, we'll go res.status 500.send, and we'll send back that error. So what does this mean? Actually, we won't send back the error because we probably don't want to give them, we don't want to give the client that much information. So we'll probably just say, well, actually, we don't have to send back anything. We'll just say status 500. So what this means is, what is this status code? There's all sorts of different status codes that you can send back from a server as a way of explaining what's happened. So a status code of 200 means everything is A-OK. A status code of 500 means there was an internal server error. There's all sorts of other ones, like 404 means we couldn't find anything. 401 means forbidden, I think. So many different types. So this is just a way of us saying something stuffed up, show an error message, basically. And the client will decide what it wants to do with that error, but we're just saying something stuffed up on our end. But hopefully we get this, and it's just going to send back the data. And that's done. That's our post request sorted. And we can test this with an awesome piece of software called Postman. Highly recommend you. So if you want to test this yourself, go download Postman. I mean, you should test this yourself. Install Postman. And Postman allows us to make API requests. Okay, and then once you've signed into Postman, we can start creating a request. So what we want to do is we want to send a post request. We're going to pretend to be the client right now. Well, we are going to be a client. And we're going to send our request to localhost on port 80. Oh, hang on, / contacts. So what we're doing is we're mimicking this. So localhost is just our computer right now. So it's going to hit this server that is running. So we can see this server is running down here. So localhost :80 / contacts will actually hit this. And we would expect that it actually saves a new thing in the database for us. So we have to send it a body. So we go body, and we'll just say form data. And then we can actually construct that object that we're going to pass it. So we're going to give it a full name, and the value is going to be Lawrence Pressland. We're going to give it a phone, and that's going to be the phone number. So something that I forgot to deal with was, in order for us to be able to access this rec.body object, we need to do this basically, app.use express.json. So this app.use is an interesting function that we can use to put middleware in our application. So what's middleware? So when a request is made, middleware is something that will happen when the request hits the server, but before we deal with it. So what's happening here is before we deal with it, it's going to go into that request and it's going to fish out the data that's being sent, and it's going to transform that data into an editable JavaScript object that we can deal with by accessing this rec.body. And then we're also going to do app.use express.url encoded. So what does that do? That's a similar thing, but this is basically, but by doing both of these, we're saying if we get data in the form of a JSON object, which is probably how we're going to send it, then, you know, put that in rec.body. But if we get it as part of a HTML form, which we haven't actually talked about, but it's a thing you can do in HTML. If it comes as a HTML form, we're going to deal with that as well, and also put that in rec.body. So by having both of these lines, it basically just means whatever data we get, we're going to now be able to deal with that in rec.body, which is what we want. And I've added this console.log here so we can see this working. So this will log out rec.body when we get this request. So let's run our server. Cool, so that's working. And then if we go into, if we hit the request on Postman, we can see some wonderful stuff has happened. So we can see here, it's actually printed out the contents of that request. And better yet, if we look at Postman, we can see what we received here is actually the object that has been stored in the database. It's got an ID, it's stored that name, and it's stored that phone number. And that's now in the database. And if we come over to MongoDB, we can actually hit this collections button in our database, and we can have a look at what's stored. So we can see there's a phone book database here. It's got a collection called contacts, and here's the actual object. So there's the ID, full name, phone number. So it's actually stored in that database now. So we can get rid of that console.log. And let's work on the request for getting those contacts. So it can be the actual same address, except this time it's a GET request because we want to get them. And so if we want to query the database, we use that model again. So this model that we've created. So before we used it to create a new object, but now we're going to use it to make a query. So contact.find, and then inside this find function, normally you would put in like some criteria. You would say, we only want ones that have, you know, the first name of this or whatever. But we just want all of them. And then we go .exec, and this will actually execute the query. And this is what gives us back our data. So error data. Cool. So just like with our last request, we can say, okay, if there's an error, then we're going to do the same thing. We're going to send back status code 500. Something's gone terribly wrong. Otherwise, we're just going to send back that data. And in this case, the data that we send back will actually be an array of all of the contacts that we have in the database. So let's test that out. We're going to have to restart our server. And then while that's loading up, I'll go here and we want to make a new request. So we don't care about passing it anything. And it's going to be a GET request this time to the same endpoint. And if we hit send, boom. Look at that. We have received an array that has one item in it. And that's the item that we stored. So this server works now. How great is that? So I'm just going to leave this running because we'll use it for some tests. I'm just going to move this to the side. And I'm going to open up a new Visual Studio window that we can use to deal with our front-end application. So open recent, Phonebook React. All right. And I'm going to start this up. npm run start. So now we're going to update some of these functions so that we're actually using the API. First thing we're going to have to do, we're actually going to need to use Axios. So npm install save Axios. Axios is a library that will allow us to do really easy requests to APIs, which is what we want to do. And now I can run that server again. Okay, so that's going to start running. So we're going to import, import Axios from Axios. And then basically we don't want this. Well, actually we'll have it like this. We'll make our contacts just a blank array at the beginning. And then we'll have a function called component did mount. And you're like, what is component did mount? So React components have some inbuilt functions that will fire at different times in the component lifecycle. So component did mount will fire when the component becomes visible. So this is when we're going to make the request. So we're going to say axios.get. We're going to make our request to localhost 80, and we'll change this when we make it live. So we're going to make our request to localhost 80 / contacts. And that's really it. That's all we need. And then if we go dot, then this is the function that will return, this is the function that will return, it will execute the function that we give it when that request actually comes back. And it will come with a response. So let's just, actually, well, we can do one better. So because we've got our state set up properly, we can just go set state, and we can set contacts to response.data, which will be that array of contacts. Whoop, what's happened? Oh, whoops, typo. Alright, so we've got that coded up, and let's see what happens when we try to run that. So if we have a look at our server, it's not worked. We've got nothing here, and this is giving us errors. And it turns out this is because of something to do with CORS. What's CORS? It stands for cross-origin something. Oh, I can't remember. Anyway, the idea is that it's generally considered unsafe for one server to be making requests to other servers that are not contained in the same domain, which is what's going on right now. So our React server is running in a different place to this server. So it's freaking out. So what we have to do, we have to make sure that our server doesn't care where it gets requests from. Otherwise it'll freak out. In order to do that, we go npm install /s CORS. So it's this neat little library that someone's made to solve this problem. And we go same sort of deal, and it's just a middleware thing. app.use CORS. Simple as that. And this will mean that our server will now allow requests from anywhere. It's not going to care if they come from the same domain or a different domain, which is necessary because this is going to be an API server, so it makes sense. So now we can get rid of, hang on, we have to run that server again. So npm start, so that starts running. Now it's running. And then this React server is still running. So we should now be able to refresh our React page, and we can see that it's worked. It's actually gotten this from the database. This is a momentous occasion if you've actually got this far. Incredible. Incredible work. You are now pretty much a pro. So we've got our function here that gets stuff and it puts it in our state. Perfect. Now we need to update our submit function so that rather than this just directly updating the state, we actually make the request to the server and then and then what? We take the new data that's actually been saved in the database. So Axios again, this time post to, whoops, hang on, localhost 80/contacts. But this time we're going to pass it something. So we're passing it an object, and this object will contain the data that we wanted to save. So remember how our server is going to go rec.body.fullname, then .phone? That's the object that we're passing here. So we no longer need that. And then, well, literally .then, we can pass in our function. This function will be called when a response comes, and that response will be that new saved, that saved data. So we can go this .state .contacts.push response.data. That's going to actually be the new object that was saved. So it will update our state, and it will update the database, and everything should actually be persistent now. So you can see how much easier this sort of stuff becomes once you hook up React to the state. We don't even need to think about what's going on here anymore, because this is a symptom of what's happening in the state. So if we look at our React app, we get rid of that. We can type a new one, Bob 12345, submit. It hasn't worked. Here's our problem. This actual set state needs to happen in here, because we have to wait for the request to actually come in, and then once the request comes in, then we update the state and we set the state, and then we're good. We refresh that. Okay, so there's, for on our server now, we can go add Jenny Hill, whose phone number is 3345, hit submit, and boom, there is Jenny Hill, and that's actually saved in the database, and we can confirm by refreshing this page, and boom, there they are. How cool is that? Our next mission is going to be to actually put this live on the internet.